the special session on the World Cycles Revisited, Diverging Trends in Prices and Quantities. I really liked this research, which I read on the internet, and I requested Dr. Antoine Camous to please come and speak to us. And I'm so happy that he agreed to do so. So I just wanted to briefly share this with you. Anthony, we are a think tank in Delhi. We've been here for now about 8 years, and we have focused on research-based policy advice to the government. In our country, these days, we are chasing a dream, a developed India by 2047. Our Prime Minister has given that call. Those initial documents were done in this think tank. And once we did the spade work, which is about 5 years ago, and lots of things happened, and then our Prime Minister last May made that announcement at Niti Aayog, which is sort of the planning, the apex planning body in our country. So this is the type of research which is undertaken in this think tank. We have also been doing lots of, and it started actually from COVID, the webinars. We try to bring in the best minds from across the world on various issues, and we try to discuss it threadbare as to what these issues are, what is the implications for India or for rest of the world. We've been very fortunate to have 6 Nobel laureates come and speak to us on various issues. One Nobel laureate came, Philip Aghion, before he got the Nobel Prize. And I thought his presentation was so strong. I told him, I said, look, Philip, we were together when he was at Harvard. I was doing a postdoctorate, and very friendly. Told him, look, your research is so thorough. This deserves a Nobel Prize. I was so pleasantly surprised a year later, he got a Nobel Prize. So we have had all sort of rigorous research presented here, public policy presented here, and we also look into geopolitics and things like tariff. And we also did we have done 4 webinars on Russia-Ukraine war. We've done lots of them on climate. So the spectrum is very wide, but basically we look at economic and economic issues. The topic that you are bringing to us today is really exciting, the diverging trends in prices and quantities. To chair this session today, Anthony, we have Dr. Surjit Bhalla. Dr. Surjit Bhalla is our advisor. He is the former executive director at the IMF. He is also the former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. And he has been on various committees in our country. He is right now also in the committee with the Ministry of Statistics and Policy Implementation. To discuss the paper, we have Sweta Saxena. Sweta Saxena was the Chief of Staff and the Director of Gender, Poverty and Social Policy Division at the UN ASCAP. From 2018 to 2022, she served as the Chief in the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And prior to that, where I started to know Sweta and her work, the solid work that she has done, got published in leading journals of the world, including American Economic Review, was when she was at the IMF. And then I realized the rigorous work that Sweta has been doing. I must share, and this is most important, our speaker for the day is Anthony. He's a research economist at Banque de France in the Financial Research Division. Prior to joining Banque de France, he was an assistant professor at the University of Mannheim and holds a PhD in economics from the European University Institute. His research focuses on macroeconomic issues related to the conduct of monetary and fiscal policy, central bank communication, financial stability, and the functioning of monetary unions. Anthony, I have myself been at the Reserve Bank of India for nearly 2.5 decades. And the issues that you are in the financial markets, we have been dealing with all these issues while I was at the Reserve Bank of India. And obviously, this is the bread and butter of any central bank. So that makes your paper far more exciting for all of us, because when you talk of diverging trends in prices and quantities, all the repo rates, monetary policy rates depend on these two variables. The reason we invited Dr. Surjit Bhalla to come and chair this session is because he has been on the monetary policy committees of the Reserve Bank, and he has been tackling these issues, addressing these issues on prices, what should be the repo rate, with us many a times in the shadow monetary policy of EGROW Foundation. With this, sir, I hand over the session to you to take the proceedings further.
Thank you, Chairman, and really welcome, Antoine. And I guess the last word, your last name is pronounced Camous, as in Camus. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So, except for, I guess, the O in there. But no, the reason I accepted the invitation to chair the session, because I think it's a most fascinating and policy relevant question. And you've gone to great, I glanced through the paper, but I thought I'll learn more about it after your presentation. I have 2 or 3 things that I think you should cover in the presentation, 2 or 3 questions. First, what Charan just said, most importantly, what does it mean for monetary policy in the setting of repo rates? Are they synchronized? And on that, I have done some work, so love to get your reactions to that. And what has happened to the degree of synchronization. Second, whether emerging markets, the countries that in your sample that are part of EMDEs, whether their synchronization with the advanced countries has really increased over time. So just a separate thing. Then, why do you want to use quarterly data? Why not annual data? So what are I'm sure there are some very good reasons why in terms of measuring of synchronization, but I guess it increases your sample size, excuse me, decreases your sample size if you use quarterly data, whereas if you use annual data, you have a lot more. And then that's why I said, and then what's the reliability? But I wouldn't want you to spend too much time, just a cursory summary on the reliability of the extended quarterly series. And last but not least, I looked at the sample of countries and what made you select those particular countries. For example, Pakistan is there, but India is not there. China is not there. And I would think that both India and China have much better quarterly data than, or certainly India. Chinese data, one never quite knows, but the Indian data with which Charan and I are both more than familiar with, that there is pretty solid quarterly data. So, but I think to reiterate, I think the topic is very sexy, very appealing, and we look forward to the conclusions and then the discussion afterwards. It's your floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the kind introduction and giving me the opportunity to present this work with Eric Monet and Damien Puy. You don't have Philippe Aguillon today, but you have a strong French accent speaking person as well. I hope that you'll be comfortable by understanding me. I also want to say before the presentation that if we don't have the chance, to interact through the limited time that is offered, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me through email if there are additional questions or ideas that could spring out of the presentation. The paper is called World Cycle Revisited. This is joint work with Eric Monet and Damien Puy. As I mentioned, Eric and Damien started the project a long time ago, and I joined relatively recently for the current iteration of the project. So I'll try to address your questions as best as I can. Naturally, the views that I'm going to express today do not reflect the views of Banque de France, the Eurosystem, or the International Monetary Fund. So to enter into this presentation, one can consider the somehow established literature that convey the sense that there is a global economic cycle that synchronizes economic variables across countries. So naturally comes to mind the very influential work by Hélène Rey about the global financial cycle and its implications for the sensitivity of economies to US monetary policy decisions. But there are also some influential works that document increasing business cycle synchronization or inflation synchronization over the last 50 years. So this project is going to ask a relatively basic question. It's going to ask whether those global economic cycles are truly global, whether they differ across the different economic variables that we can consider, and whether they have evolved and how they have evolved over time. So to address those questions, we bring three things. The first one, which is a substantial contribution of this project, is that it comes with a release of a macro financial database that has a very long horizon. So it starts from the 1950s. And as was mentioned, supplies variables at a quarterly frequency, which is an asset to revisit in terms of global economic cycles. So armed with this database, then we conduct an empirical evaluation of world cycles, and there's two salient facts that I'm going to emphasize during the presentation. The first one is that the synchronization behaviors of quantity and price variables is quite different over time and across countries, and that trade and financial integration, the key engines of globalizations, also have differential effect on the synchronization of economic variables. As a concluding element of this project, we also provide a little model that explains the diverging effect of financial integration on price and quantity synchronization. So let me start by advertising this macro financial data set that is released and associated to this project. I think it's a very interesting database that can be put to use to many economic questions. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just to present the key characteristics of this database. So the underlying source of the data comes from the IMF. So the IMF has been collecting the statistics at the global level through its International Financial Statistics Department. And so some of those data, especially those that dates back prior to 1980s and for a large set of countries, have never been digitized and made available online. So that's the contribution of the data contribution of the project here. So this data set has some very appealing properties. The first one is that the variables are reported at a quarterly frequency, and the panel dimension of the database is truly global. So it covers advanced economy and emerging markets alike, quite for substantial coverage of variables. So just to give a sense of the depth of the data set, so it's not a balanced data set, but here the table reports the number of countries that are fully covered for each of those variables since 1950s. So there's more countries, there's more data, but this does give a sense of the total coverage from the 1950s to 2019 for those five variables. So broadly speaking, there's more than 40 countries that are covered for those five variables over the time period considered. So the dataset has 5 key variables. The first one is real GDP. The second is real credit, which is defined as credit granted by domestic bank to domestic firms. Stock prices, which tracks the evolution of major national stock price index. Real bond yields, which are defined as bond yields on sovereign debt with a maturity longer than 7 years, and inflation defined in a standard way as CPI. So the database provides a global coverage of those essential macroeconomic variables and allows to conduct study that allows to contrast the globalization period and prior to the globalization period to single out the effect of trade and financial integration on various economic mechanisms. So I was asked what is the strength of this data set compared to data sources that are readily available. In some sense, we combined both an extended coverage and a quarterly frequency. So the major historical long databases such as Jordache, Schularik, Taylor, or the Penworld tables, they have a long time coverage, but they come at an annual frequency, which does not allow to capture really short-run economic cycles because they are filtered out through the annual aggregations. On the other hand, the other database that have a quarterly frequency, such as the data provided by the OECD or the BIS, they usually have short samples, so they date back maximum to 1990s, and they have a very limited coverage, the OECD by definition, so it does not provide harmonized data for emerging markets. Another element that I want to emphasize is that before releasing the data, we have conducted some work to make sure that data quality was up to the best practices. So, for instance, GDP is reconstructed based on disaggregation of industrial production that avoids the sort of naive linear interpolations that are made usually in a historical data set. And another appealing features for the credit series, for instance, is that we don't have a break in the time series because we use when there is a change in definition, instead of having a jump of which is tied to the definition, we use the multiple vintage to make sure that our time series are relatively smooth. So overall, the data set provides an harmonized set of data at the world level at a quarterly frequency, and that's a key strength to revisit the questions about world cycles. Okay. So just very briefly to illustrate the database, right? Just to visualize some of the data that we provide. Here, I report for selected country, the time series for GDP. So what is in gray in those graphs are in the top panel here at the official GDP growth series, which are available at a quarterly frequency for the US and France since the 1950s. And in green, this is the time series that we provide. And so the comparing green and gray for France and the United States is reassuring in the sense that our time series tracks extremely well the time series of the official statistic for those two countries. Now, the lower panel give a sense of the type of coverage extension that our dataset allows. So in gray, again, we have the values of real GDP as provided by the Penworld table. These are the official statistics. So for Chile, that's available at a quarterly frequency since the mid-1990s. And similarly for India, it's available at a quarterly frequency since the mid-1990s. And in green, what is reported is the extension of the time series that we provide through the dataset. For instance, for India, that dates back to 1950s. So that's quite a substantial increase in the availability of data. So I could comment similarly on, other time series. The general message is that our dataset allows to close data gap availability, especially for emerging market and prior to the 1980s for critical macroeconomic variables. So that's the potential to extend a lot of analysis to a much larger set of countries and a much larger time period, which is precisely what we do in this project by revisiting the question of world cycles. So let me now present the elements that are related to the economic question of interest, namely whether global cycles are global, whether they are common to different economic variables, and how they have evolved over time. So in terms of methodology, which we as closely as possible to what the literature is doing, precisely for the purpose of comparability. So the methodology is relatively simple. The first thing we do is that we estimate some dynamic factor model that allows to extract for each of those variables a global factor that we interpret as the world economic cycle for each of those variables. The second thing that we do is then that we measure for each variable the sensitivity of domestic fluctuation to the global economic cycle. So for doing that, we perform a variance decomposition and we measure the share of the total fluctuation, let's say, of GDP for France over the period that is explained by the world cycle, and that gives a sense of the strength of the world cycle in driving co-movements in economic activity across countries. And finally, we run some panel estimation, which are relatively standard in the literature, to measure the effect of trade and financial integration on the time evolution of those world cycles. So we're going to emphasize three key messages through three key empirical facts. The first one, which was already disclosed in the title of the project, is that we document that there is very diverging behaviors of the synchronization of price and quantity variables. So price variables such as inflation and asset prices, they exhibit a rising and a strong global co-movement, whereas quantity variables, prominently output and credit, they remain relatively weakly synchronized, especially in Europe in normal times, namely outside exceptional economic contraction events such as the global financial crisis. The second element that we emphasize is that globalization did not substantially increase output synchronization. So it did contribute to increase asset price synchronization, even if asset price synchronization precedes the time of globalization, the 1980s, but output at the global level was not increasingly synchronized during the globalization period. And the third fact that I'm going to emphasize is that trade and financial integration, they have a differential effect on how those variables are synchronized. So trade synchronize price and quantities in the same direction, whereas financial integration tends to synchronize more asset prices, but does not have a substantial effect on output synchronization. So let me first present briefly the key properties of the world cycles, and then the results that support each of those facts that we emphasize in the paper. So if I talk about the global economic cycle, I just want to represent the global economic cycle, even if its economic magnitude is not really easy to appreciate. So this is the common factor for real GDP that is estimated on our data set. And so that's visually the global economic cycle for real GDP as estimated over the entire data set from the 1950s. Again, the relative magnitude is not easy to interpret, but we do observe some salient economic events that come out from this estimation. So we see the effect of the global financial crisis on the global contraction of output, or the effect of the oil price shock in the 1970s on the global contraction of output. Okay, so this is the world cycle for one variable. For real GDP, we perform the same exercise for each of the variable. And an element of interest when we compute the correlation of those different cycles is that the quantity variables, output and credit, they are relatively well synchronized. So there is a common economic cycle that drives both output and credit. But then after, when we compute similar correlation with the price variables, stock prices, bond yields, and inflation, then the correlations are much, much weaker, which suggests that, you know, for quantities, there is a global economic cycle which is relatively shared across those variables. But then when it comes for the global movements of stock prices, bond yields, and inflation, there are very strong variable-specific factors that explain the synchronization across countries. Okay, so that's the first interesting fact. There's no such thing as one global economic cycles. There are economic cycles that are very much variable specifics. Okay, especially in particular for the price variables and stock prices in particular. Okay. So let me now turn to the key results of the paper. So on this histogram, we report the outcome of the variance decomposition exercise, namely that's the share for each variable, output, credit, and then the price variable, share price, bond yields, and inflation, which are explained by the respective world cycle that has been estimated. So the unrestricted specification reported in gray here over the full sample highlights that output and credit are relatively less synchronized at the global level than the price variable, share prices, bond yields, and inflation. And to make sure that those results are not driven by exceptional events, so the oil crisis and the global financial crisis, we re-estimate the same exercise over the dataset, excluding those two periods. And the key message remains essentially quantity variables are much less synchronized at the global level than are price variables, as reflected in this graph here. Okay. A second element that might be of interest is whether this result is the outcome of the composition of our data set. So we have conducted many exercises to confirm that the behavior of prices and quantities is different, but one that is relatively expected as an exercise is to contrast the synchronization behavior of those variables for advanced economy and emerging markets. So this is what is reported in this histogram, where the gray lines report the extent of synchronization for advanced economy, and the blue lines the extent of synchronization for emerging markets. So two elements. The first one is that you can observe for both advanced economy and emerging markets that synchronization is relatively lower for quantity variables than it is for price variables. And the second fact comes to comparing gray and blue bars. There is a larger level of synchronization for advanced economy than for emerging markets. But this difference does not affect the result that prices are substantially more synchronized than are quantity variables here. The second fact that we want to emphasize relates to the time variation of this strength of world cycles. So here what we do is that we report the same statistic, the variance decomposition, namely the share of domestic economic fluctuation, which is explained by the global economic cycles, over different subperiods. So we have the Bretton Woods, what we call the Bretton Woods period, then the oil shocks period of the 1970s, the globalization that starts in the mid-1980s as dated by historians. And then for the most recent period, we single out the global financial crisis, by definition contributes to the strong synchronization of variables, and we report the post-global financial crisis. The strength of the quarterly nature of the dataset allows to perform those time estimation, because with quarterly data rather than annual data, we have 4 more times data, and we can precisely estimate those elements on limited time sum periods. So that's one of the key strengths of the dataset here. So the first point that I want to emphasize from this graph is that the results that I presented before, namely that price variables are more synchronized than quantity variables, is a result which is robust to the time evolution and the different time period that you consider. So you see that the green line, which is the synchronization for stock prices, and the red line, which is synchronization for inflation, are systematically higher for all subperiods than the quantity variable output and credit. The second element that we can take from this graph is that the synchronization of stock prices started to increase prior to the globalization period. In other sense, you don't need a full current account liberalization to have a strong synchronization of asset prices across countries. And this increase this tendential increase has been maintained up to the most recent period. In contrast, when we look at the extent of synchronization of global output and credit, they remain relatively low. This is something that we've already seen from the previous graph. And if one abstracts from the global financial crisis, it has not substantially increased over time. In particular, the globalization period has not substantially increased the synchronization of output and credit here. So now that we have documented those elements, we would like to understand what is the effect of globalization on the synchronization of those economic variables, and in particular, understand how trade and financial integrations influence the share of domestic fluctuations that are explained by world cycles. So to capture trade integration, we use as variable trade openness, which is defined as export plus import divided by GDP. And we show that trade openness is associated with higher output and asset price synchronization. To measure financial openness, we rely on standard metrics in the literature, which is the Chinito index, which is a de jure measure of financial integration. And we show that variation in the Chinito index is associated to higher asset price synchronization, but stable, if not lower, synchronization of output. And that we think is a kind of a surprising result. And one way to think about this surprising dimension is that asset prices, by definition, are claims on output. So we need to understand how, a financial asset, which is a claim of output, can have synchronization properties that are relatively different. So here I presented the results. This is the key estimation that we conduct. So our left-hand side variable is the share of variance explained by the world cycle for country I at time t, and we regress these variables on an indicator of trade openness and an indicator of financial openness, and we adopt relatively demanding specifications with time and country fixed effect. So the table reports the estimation of this regression for the variance for the share of output, which is explained by the world cycle, that's column 1 and 2, and for the share of asset price variation, which is reported in column 3 and 4. What we can see is that an increase in trade openness contributes quite substantially and precisely to increase output synchronization and has, a positive, if not mild, effect on asset price synchronization. In contrast, financial openness is associated to an increase in asset price synchronization. That's something that we can intuitively anticipate. But in contrast, the effect of output is at best 0 and if not negative, okay, which is the surprising results that I emphasized before, namely what is the how can a claim on output be differently synchronized than the underlying output, okay? So that's the final part of the paper, where we ask, how can we explain that contrasting effect of financial integration on output and asset price synchronization? So here, the contribution is to provide a mechanism. We don't provide a structurally estimated model. We provide a plausible mechanism that can rationalize those two facts. So the mechanism is built within a two-country general equilibrium model that has two salient features. The first one is that countries, they can form a portfolio of domestic and international assets with the objective to get insurance against domestic income shocks. So that's a standard mechanism of risk sharing with a notion of financial frictions that reflect the extent of financial integration between those two countries. Now, countries anticipating the risk-sharing frontier that they can have access to, given a level of financial integration, then they choose the properties of their production structures. And they can choose different production technologies that differs in risk, in return, and in co-movement of the realization of those variables across countries. So what we do with that model is that we simply characterize the solution to the model, and then we compute within the model the counterpart of the statistics that we have derived from the data set. So the statistic that we are interested in is the co-movement across countries of asset prices and output as a function of financial integration. And our objective is to assess whether this interplay between the international portfolio choice and the endogenous production choice can generate this observed pattern that financial integration has a differential effect on asset price synchronization and output synchronization. So that was the wordy presentation of the model. I'm going to very briefly comment on the formal treatment. Maybe some of you are working with similar environments. So very quickly, the model is, as I mentioned, a two-country model in general equilibrium, where each of the countries, they have a locus tree that provides income every period. Very importantly, for tractability, the model is an overlapping generation model. That's a little modeling trick that makes the resolution of this model very easy. So the two key choices are reflected in those equations. I'm not going to, I promise you, I apologize in advance, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but that gives a sense of how we construct the argument here. So each period, a young generation in country I is solving a standard consumption smoothing problem. And the choice they have to make is precisely tied to the portfolio of assets they want to bring from their young age to their old age. So the budget constraint when they are young make relatively easy understanding what's the economic problem which is captured by this model. Namely, the individual in country I is going to choose how much to consume today, given that it has received income from the Lucas tree, and it can borrow from international market, but importantly, it can also acquire domestic assets. So mu is the quantity of domestic assets that they buy at price I, or foreign assets. So in country I, they can buy the assets in country J at the price PJ. Now, what happens next period when they return, when they receive the return of the assets? Well, essentially, they can consume the proceeds of their financial investment, and the return on the portfolio is made of the dividend you earn from the domestic asset plus the dividend you earn from the foreign asset plus the resale value of the asset. But there is this 1 minus tau component here that captures the extent of financial friction. If tau is equal to 1, there is complete financial autarky between those two countries. If tau is equal to 0, there is perfect financial integration between those two countries. So that's the risk-sharing block of the model. Now, anticipating the risk sharing, the equilibrium risk sharing properties, then countries, they can choose the type of production technology that they undertake. So that's captured by this variable eta, and eta essentially parameterizes the mean and the variance of the output which is provided by the domestic Lucas tree. Okay. So this is the main result from the model. On the left panel here, we have the co-movement statistics that I'm trying to explain as a function of financial integration. So for low level of financial integrations, we are almost in financial autarky. And when tau is equal to 0, there is perfect financial integration. So as we can see here, when financial integration increases, there is a more globalized demand for each type of asset. Okay, so if tau is very large, if there's no financial integration, each demand for the asset is going to be purely domestic. If tau is equal to 0, the demand for each asset will be truly international. And that contributes to increase the synchronization of asset prices, because asset prices are no longer sensitive to domestic income shocks, but they are just sensitive to global income shocks. So the second implication is that the financial integration allows countries to improve risk sharing and insurance. And so in turn, countries can choose technologies that have a higher eta, which means that they have higher returns, but they have higher risk and they are less correlated across countries. And that in turn generates patterns of output co-movement, which is stable if not decreasing as financial integration proceeds. Okay. Well, I think I'm doing relatively good on time and leaving some space for a discussion. The main takeaways from this study is that there are global cycles, but it's not a unique economic force that leads the co-movement of all variables. Global economic cycles are very variable specifics, and they have very different properties for price or for quantity variables. The second element that we do find interesting is that financial globalization has differential effect on the property of price and quantity synchronization. In terms of policy implications, I think that we've already touched what's the big question which comes out of this project, which is that if prices and real activity react very differently to global forces, this generates possibly complicated situations for monetary authority that usually have a standard objective of stabilizing inflation and real activity. Okay, so we've seen, for instance, recently a global surge in inflation, but residual level of economic activities that were strongly country-specific, and monetary authorities had to find out whether they wanted to look through the inflationary shock or whether they wanted to address those elements that were maybe beyond their control. I also want to make, as a last word, some advertisement for this database that can be put to work to undertake a large set of studies. So there are some researchers at the BIS that have used our data so far to look at the macroeconomic effect of weather shocks, or to document the economic experience of policymakers and try to understand their policy preferences. Okay, so that was the general message that I wanted to convey today. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My apologies. India is very much part of the sample. I don't know how I missed that, but China isn't. I have some questions on the data, etc. But let Ms. Saxena give the comments, and then I'll come to. Go ahead. Sweta? Yeah. You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bhalla. Let me actually begin by thanking Charan for asking me to be a discussant to this very interesting paper. It holds a lot of promise. And thanks, Antoine, for a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. And somehow, when the author is going through the presentation, you understand that what you understood was the right thing or not. So it was good. I know the presentation was very clear, but let me still quickly summarize the paper and for you. And then I'll follow up with a few of my own thoughts on how you can strengthen the paper. So the authors, for the benefit of others, the authors assemble a new quarterly macro financial data set from 1950 to 2019. It covers GDP, credit, consumer prices, stock price, and sovereign yields across about 40 countries, addressing historical gaps in previous data. They also estimate word cycles via using the dynamic factor models, and they find a persistent disconnect between price and financial synchronization and quantity, which is output and credit synchronization. They find that asset prices, especially stocks, show increasing world co-movement over time. Real quantities like GDP and credit do not show rising synchronization with globalization and have even declined post GFC. So the authors propose a very parsimonious model, as you've seen, Antoine has just showed us, that links financial integration to higher risk sharing, hence more synchronized prices, but also to riskier heterogeneous production structures, reducing output co-movement. Now, Antoine, I'm going to raise a few of the areas for discussion, and some of these points might have been raised by my colleagues at the IMF, Giovanni and Maury, and all these people who have actually already discussed the paper. So first one is about identification and factor model assumptions. Now, the paper is using dynamic factor models to extract common components. It's very standard, I understand that in the business cycle literature, but factor extraction, it assumes stationarity and time invariant loadings. So world cycles might shift structure over decades from Bretton Woods to post 1971, which can also bias your factor estimates. And without any structural breaks or time loadings, results on the trend synchronization may be overstated or misinterpreted. So something to think about. Second is about the data set composition and coverage. Yes, the countries in the data set vary by variables. As you also showed, 37 for GDP, only 26 for stock prices, 18 for sovereign yields. So these imbalances could bias comparisons across variables because, more extensive data for prices could mechanically just increase the estimated synchronicity relative to quantities. And the model lumps advanced and emerging markets together despite different integration level. Actually, I noticed that it wasn't in your paper, but I think you showed a slide with the emerging and advanced countries separately right now, which wasn't in the paper, at least the paper that I was looking at didn't have that. Third is about the role of policy regimes and frequency interactions. The analysis might conflate policy regime changes like monetary regimes, capital control liberalization with globalization effects. The monetary turn in the 80s and major capital account liberalization these things could drive your price co-movement independent of structural risk sharing. And also the frequency domains effects like short versus business cycle frequencies, they aren't explored. Are co-movements at cyclical versus trend frequencies different? Something we couldn't find out in the paper. Fourth is about the model mechanism and empirical validation. So the theoretical mechanism that's posited in the paper is that financial integration leads to riskier production choices and thus idiosyncrasies in real sectors. However, the direct empirical evidence linking integration to industry risk profiles or production microdata is absent. There's no data that actually shows that. So without validating this channel, the model just risks being a stylized narrative, rather than explaining any kind of explanation grounded in firm level behavior. Fifth is about the neglect of global shocks and common drivers. The paper focuses on global factors, but doesn't robustly test for specific common shocks like commodity prices, US monetary policy, global risk premium. There's a lot of literature, and more recent at the IMF also, that shows that certain global financial shocks can explain a non-trivial share of credit and asset price variation. So integrating these kind of shocks into your empirical strategy might alter estimates of world cycle strengths and challenge claims about modest roles of global factors. So something to think about. Now, the sixth one is about endogeneity of integration measures. Now, trade and financial integration metrics, they're treated as exogenous, but integration itself could actually be endogenous to world cycle phases. So making all this causal inference very difficult. Last but not the least, I just want to say that it would be great to see some robustness tests. For instance, as you said yourself, the paper uses Gini to measure for financial integration. I agree it's widely used, but we also know some of the disadvantages. It's the problem is that it's a de jure measure. Would be great to use some of the de facto ones using Milasi Ferretti lane data. I mean, that's a very widely available data set. And I think I saw, Gianna Maria just recently came out with another edition of his data set on LinkedIn. So it's quite an updated data set and for a large set of countries as well. And definitely will have the countries that you are actually looking at. And again, doing decompositions at regional levels, distinguish advanced and emerging, which you've already done, and also use some of the data to actually talk about. I'm sure most of the people must have mentioned actually that, well, when you're just using trade as X plus minus, I mean, just basic trade, but because of the global value chains, there could be more synchronization of prices without affecting quantities. So thinking about what kind of data you can use in order to show that trade effect and trade integration. So in summary, just let me actually say it actually makes an empirical contribution with a new data set. And as you said, people at PS have already extracted the data set and used it. And you have compelling evidence of decoupled price and quantity cycles. But the methodological assumptions and identification issues can actually limit the strength of causal claims and policy implications. So perhaps you might want to actually, just to capture, test robustness to time varying parameters, explicit shock identification, and also link theoretical mechanisms to micro evidence. Thanks. I'll stop here and over to you, Dr. Bhalla.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I hope Charan Singh will be back because it's better for him to organize the questions. I had a couple of questions. One is, the Chin-Ito index. We have used it, myself and my colleagues, on trying to explain inflation, etc. And it's really much in the nature of a dummy variable. So to work on it over time, and so it's a constant value, different for different countries, but it really doesn't vary over time. I don't know, openness is something that all of us have worried about. I think the Chin-Ito index is readily available. They have, but and if you look at your results, it's significant at the 10% level. It's never more than that. So some comments as to how much is it really adding to the story as well as to the explanation. So, so I have real. Second, on China not being there is, in terms of output synchronization. I think if China were there, you would get negative effects of synchronization. They didn't seem to be on any global pattern for the last 35 years. Only in the last 3 or 4 years is there synchronization. Maybe that's why you don't. But it is, anybody looks at the data and China not there, when it's certainly an important way. Last question, stock prices. Why only 47 countries or 26 countries for stock prices? Certainly since about 1985, you may not have stock prices going all the way back to 1950. That I completely understand. But, break the sample up into post 1980, and you will get a lot of, and certainly post 1990. So you still have, for each country, 100 observations if you do it by quarters. So some, sensitivity as to how that works. So now I guess I have to, this is something I'm very bad at in terms of getting, so Charan, where are you? I have to go to the chat box and Let me, oh, there he is. Charan, you want to take
Yeah,
over? You know, I always hand it over to you
right.
for this last round. Yeah.
I don't know
Thank you.
if Anthony wants
I'm
to.
still here. So, yeah.
Yes,
you are.
please, if I can
Anthony?
take just 1 or 2 minutes to reply to all those great questions, otherwise I will forget them. First of all, I want to thank you
And
for
Anthony, you can also cover the discussants issues that she raised.
yes, of
Yeah,
course.
so
That's exactly
sure.
what I have in mind, because that's an excellent discussion that points a bit at the a bit of the limits. I would not say the limits, but the choices that we made in the study. And so I'm going to try, to defend a bit what we do here. But all points are extremely well taken here. So there was a bit of a question about whether the factor model were truly well identified, and whether there could not be some robustness check that would guarantee that there would not be spurious elements. So especially because of the time variation that you mentioned and the possible change in the policy regime. So here again, our objective is not to estimate things precisely, but to try to make a qualitative statements about the effect of the synchronization on prices and quantities. And we also want to stay close to the literature. That's why we choose this very basic specification. So now, I think one of the exercise that goes a bit in that supports our results is the one where we split the sample in different time variations, because there we get rid of the possible lack of stationarity over the entire period and the switch in the policy regime that could drive the results. So that's a graph that I do find quite reassuring in some sense. Against those pushback about misspecifications or about conflating factors. An element of interest that came to my mind while you mentioned the effect of policy regime changes. So you say, yeah, that your results are not necessarily driven by globalization. There's multiple things that have happened, and I fully agree. What I do find interesting, and that's going to talk also about the measure of financial integration, is that during the Bretton Woods period, where capital accounts were highly regulated, where the value of the Chininto index were very low for all countries, we do observe already a high effect of synchronization of asset prices, which is quite surprising, because we would expect either through arbitrage or through actual quantity integration that you would need to see some financial integration for that. And that, I think, the most interesting hypothesis is precisely related to what you mentioned, which is the coordination of policy regime. Namely, in a world of fixed exchange rates, asset prices are sensitive to domestic monetary conditions. But if monetary conditions needs to be synchronized through the exchange rate regime, that will generate mechanically the synchronization of asset prices. So I think that's a very interesting economic channel to think about. There's so many things we can do around that topic and with this data set. So you mentioned the effect of US monetary policy, oil price shocks. These are exercises that exist in the appendix of the previous versions of the paper. Naturally, one of the ambition was a bit to revisit all those classic results. I can point to some elements, but I think that what we would like to do in the future is to produce short notes on each of those elements using and that will contribute a bit to enrich the discussion. But between you and me, the editor asked us to produce a very lean version of the paper when the original versions had all of those exercises here. So finally, let me try to mention a bit what the contentious choice of the Chininto index for measuring financial integration, if I may do it this way, right? So there's two ways you can measure financial integration. Either you take the de jure measures that states how open capital accounts are across countries, or you can take de facto measures that looks at quantity integration. So none of those two metrics have perfect features. So you already mentioned that the variation in the Chinito index and its measure can be a bit quite subjective. The literature tend to think that de facto measures are even worse. Okay, so what you would capture, you would not capture financial integration, you would capture essentially Luxembourg and Cayman Islands, right? If you just want to look at where the assets are located. And so that's why the literature is a bit split between those two metrics. It seemed to us that to capture trade integrations, that could be reflected in the structural quantity-based metrics of international trade integration, whereas for financial integrations, where flows are extremely volatile in terms of quantities, and there are also some strategic location of the assets. I mentioned Luxembourg or some other jurisdiction. That would also conflate a bit the results. So the outcome is not very, the debate is open here. And so finally, regarding the coverage for stock prices, so I'm not the right person to tell you exactly why there's only 27 countries that start in the 1950s. But here again, maybe if I was not clear, the data set, the numbers of countries that I reported is the number of countries that starts from 1950 Q1. If country stock markets have started to expand in the 1960s, for instance, they would not be counted, but in 2019 they would be there. So there would be 40 plus countries. That's the unbalanced property of the data set, and I think that the choices of Damien that really built the data set was to make sure that data quality and reliability was credible. And I wish I had China, and I wish I had Eastern Europe. That's something that was not collected by the IMF at that time. So there are some gaps, but we have some other places here. I hope I covered those points carefully.
Anthony, there are questions in the chat box. Do you want to have a glance at them?
Yes, I need to see the chat. Yes, it's here. Okay.
Yeah. See, there's a question from Manuela Dan on AI. Then there is one from, again, AI reduces operational cost. Do you want to cover that? And anybody who else wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. You can ask a question even now. You explained so well. Dr. Saxena has been also asking that question. So did the chair. You're in the Banque de France of an important country.
Mm-hmm.
And as it is, we in the central bank are always looking at monetary fiscal issues. So Anthony, I'm going to share a thought with you.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you are comfortable answering, fine. If you're not, I think that I need the central banks to think about it. You remember, Anthony, all these years, our training in our universities has been the fiscal deficit is an evil and we need to avoid it at any cost. And debt to GDP ratio, of course, sanctified by the Maastricht Treaty, should be 3% and 60% of deficit and debt. After COVID, do the pundits in your countries or countries in your part of the world still hold on to that view?
Okay, so that's the $1 million question. So that's where I'm going to reaffirm that the views expressed are my own and personal and do not reflect the views of the Banque de France, the Eurosystem, the ECB, or anyone else in this building. That's a first order concern. That's a first order issue. And I think actually I've been thinking about it because our data set can help us to say some things about this maybe. So, people make usually statements about those numbers, debt to GDP ratios and fiscal deficits that sometimes, they don't really realize. They compare, for instance, the nominal interest rate to growth or something like this. And that makes an assessment of sovereign debt sustainability not really easy to conduct. And one thing that, for instance, Olivier Blanchard has been put forward was to say, well, what really matters for debt sustainability is whether the dynamic effect of interest rates is offset or not by the growth rate of the economy. So that's a bit comparing the average interest rates on the debt you have to pay against the growth rate of the economy. If the real rate on debt is equal to the growth rate of the economy, well, there's no snowball effect of interest rates on the evolution of the debt to GDP ratio. So I think that's something that we should look at. Nobody, everybody thought 20 years ago that a certain threshold level of debt was not to be, it was deadly to go beyond, let's say, 100% of GDP. We have seen countries that have very different level of debt to GDP ratio. And what really matters at the end of the day is whether the interest rate dynamics is in line with the growth fundamental of a country or not. And the database provides three variables: real GDP, real bond yields, and inflation, that actually allows to perform a statistical analysis as to whether the change in these metrics affects macroeconomic dynamics in different countries. So that's certainly a first order topic. I think that everybody is looking and thinking about this object, sovereign debt, in terms of fiscal sustainability, in terms of monetary policy implementation, in terms of monetary fiscal interactions. We see that some countries are challenging the established institutional arrangements between monetary and fiscal policy, and we might wonder whether this is precisely driven by debt funding costs or other considerations. That's a first order topic to investigate. And I think that the database could be put at work to think about those problems by combining those variables that could help to make an assessment about whether debt is sustainable or not.
I totally agree with you, but my worry is, given your research today that you have presented, does the Taylor rule then hold? Because Taylor rule at the end of the day is going to bring these quantities and the prices together. Now, if there's going to be a divergence in the series, then what do we do? And if the fiscal policies are going to, so far the combined wisdom of the economist, and I've been trained in the Western universities, so I'm not trying to be a rebel here. All I'm trying to say is we need to rethink our theories. Now, there is divergence taking place in prices and quantities, as you have shown, and the Taylor rule probably will have to be redefined. Or we have to think of our policies in the last 15 years, 17 years. Where are they heading? And or our assumptions, were they correct? I'm not sure. I'll just give you one illustration. In our own country, India, by the way, the debt sustainability, I thought the best article ever written on debt sustainability is by F.C. Domer in the American Economic Review of 1944. I think that's the best article. After that, all
With the author,
mathematics.
sorry?
F.C. Domer
Okay.
in American Economic Review, 1944. I think that's the best article written on debt sustainability. After that, it has taken mathematical shapes, this and that, and all those fineness, but I think that's all camouflaging the truth. So the illustration that I was giving, in a country like India, where we have been always coming from IMF, World Bank, the wisdom that deficit is going to be a disaster. The fiscal deficit is going to be a disaster. We have been incurring it from 1980. I'm not talking of fiscal profligacy. But what I'm saying is there's some, and we never had a disaster. And now when the Western world has recorded deficit and debt to GDP ratios much beyond the Maastricht Treaty, that used to be used to profess to us what to do and what not to do, in last 15, 17 years, I don't see much has happened. Much disaster means we all know what's happening in the global economy and we know the critical cycles that we know. But all I'm trying to reiterate is maybe our theories, and I'm part of the economic profession trained in the Western world, maybe our theories need a revisit. Bhalla sir.
Yeah. Sorry to keep bringing this up, but I've worked with a lot of cross-country data for the last 30 years and assembling the very elaborate data set that you have. So if you could just expand on the reasons as to why China is not there. It could be because Chinese data are not available, or it could be that they are not reliable, or neither of those two. But its impact on the world economy, and you followed what's happening with Trump tariffs and this and that, they're all geared towards what China has done. So we don't have China as part of the explanation. I think the data set loses some of its appeal. So I'm sure you have very good reasons, but if you expand on that, and I may end up agreeing with your reasons, but I think we need to know why it's not there. Eastern European countries I can understand, but China is unique.
So maybe I'm going to go back to my co-author and tell them that we need to fix that thing here. So again, the data comes from a box at the IMF of papers that were collected from the 1950s. And my take is that from the 1950s to the late 1970s, China didn't have a modern statistical agency to report those elements, and that they joined the international chorus a bit later on. So I think that's why China does not enter. But our database is fully consistent with the quarterly data, the recent ones that are being released by the IMF. So that's how we complete the data set, right? So the next iteration is going to be until 2025, because we just need to take the IMF data and add them here. So I'm going to have a look at China, and just to have a sense of, when did China started to supply statistics that were deemed to be reliable by international agencies to be integrated into those data sets. I agree. It's in the 1950s, that's 25% of global population. So if you want to talk about global economic cycles, maybe it's better to have this country being included there. But I'm going to report your concerns to my co-authors, and I hope that they will provide a good solution.
And I think just to actually answer, I think Antoine might be right actually, because back in those days, China didn't submit to the IMF for the IFS statistics. However, Antoine, I do believe that China would have it personally. So they will have their own books in which they have this data. Perhaps it might be worth the effort. I mean, to go and look into the Chinese manuals and pull that data out. Because I myself have inputted a lot of the Chinese data myself when I used to work a lot more in China back in the early 2000s. And so they do have it. They just didn't probably submit. So I think it might be worth your while.
Yes.
This question
Thank you
might
for
come,
that.
But is it because you want, or if you choose a variable, that it has to be available for every year, for every country? Is that the constraint? Otherwise, China has very good data, let's say from 1990 onwards. Even the Indian data is not very reliable prior to the late 90s. So
No, I fully agree with you. Again, our contribution is mainly to provide the data prior to 1990s for emerging market economies. Data from the 1990s from China, they're available on the IMF data portal. So we just need to merge them, right? To add a column China and to bring the IMF data into it from the time. But that's not a contribution per se in terms of data release, because most of our contribution in terms of data release is about quarterly data for emerging markets prior to 1980s.
All right, maybe we should come to an end now. I'm sure you in France, middle of the day, 100 things to do. We are on a Friday evening now, and 100 things to do here too on the weekend. Right? So I think we'll come to an end to this. Thank you so much for coming around, sharing your research with us, which I thought is very important. And I thought it has lots of policy implications for monetary policy experts and people like us who are working on the both monetary fiscal issues. I think for central bankers, your research is really very, very important and they need to have a look at it. In an emerging country like ours, first time I discovered there's a dichotomy between the broad money and narrow money and the relationship with the prices. That was around 97. That suddenly we find that no, that relationship doesn't hold, the quantity equation doesn't hold, and therefore the narrow money is holding on, but not the broader money. And I think this sort of research always brings fresh ideas and gives direction to the policy. So I must thank you for that. I must thank our discussant, Dr. Saxena, for having studied the paper and brought such thoughts on the table. Our chair, Dr. Bhalla, he is the advisor to our think tank, and he's always available for rigorous research and comments on the same. Sir, I want to thank you. Yes, sure, sir.
Yeah, just to pursue the China story from my own personal experience. And this is a problem. China was poverty is a very important part of analyzing how countries have progressed, etc. Now, China does its surveys, but does not release the data to anybody, the unit level data. What they will provide to the World Bank is the urban distribution and this is the rural distribution. Okay? For such an important variable, they will not provide the data. So my suspicion is that a lot of these data you will not be able to get. And if that is the case, I think it's an important part of a footnote in your paper that this is what the leading country is not providing you with the data. And then you say, that's why we haven't included it. But I think it's my persistence on this that, it just doesn't. So what is going on? And as you know, in the case of India, Indian economists have said our data are not reliable, this, that, whatever. How, I just think you cannot get away with that you will bring it up. You have to give reasons why, a long footnote, why China's data is not in your data set. I'm just being honest. And I've shared this experience with you because I was at the World Bank and, it's a mug's game trying to get Chinese data. But thank you very much.
Effort. Yeah. I thank you all very much. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to contact me by email. And I wish you all a good weekend. And me, I'm going to go on with my lunch now. Thank you very much.
So I must thank each one of you, the participants too. And I must make an announcement for the next week. Anthony, if you can join, that'll be fun. We are having a presentation from Professor Warwick from Australian National University on tariffs and its implication on economic growth of the world. So from Australian National University, what Professor Warwick will be speaking. And Professor Warwick has also worked. I think he has very wide experience. He has worked in he was on the board of the Australian Central Bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia. So he is going to bring in a wealth of information for all of us to ponder over. So I would invite all of you to be with us. I'm reiterating this because I thought it's important. And the second important thing is the timing is going to be different. He is going to be speaking from 12 noon to 1 p.m. Australia is way ahead of us, the time zone. France, of course, is different. So please, next Friday, 12 noon to 1 p.m., I would welcome you all for the special talk on the tariffs and the world economic growth. Once again, let me thank each one of you. Have a great weekend. Have a great day ahead, Anthony, and look forward to interacting with you more often. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.